So, good morning. My discussion for today is Module 6, Victimization and Victimology. So, yung discussion natin is iikot lang sa victimization and victimology. So, first, study of crime victims. Victimology implies something theoretical that 50 years ago plainly did not exist. So, victimology, hindi daw siya nag-i-exist noon. Okay, 40 years ago, it was seen as a hodgepodge of ideas, interests, ideologies, and research methods that have been rather arbitrarily grouped. Okay? Humanistic victimology represented by the victim assistance community, while scientific victimology naman, which for him was part of criminology. So, yan ang study of crime o victim natin noon. Noon daw, hindi nag-i-exist yung tinatawag nating victimology. Okay? Pero syempre, ngayon, okay, dahil nasa 21st century na tayo, meron na tayong tinatawag na victimology at pinag-aaralan na rin natin yan. Next, victimology emerged as an applied discipline. Okay? First symposium 1973, key conclusions, 10th symposium Montreal. 50s and 60s dramatic change, 80s and 90s consolidation and theorizing. UN Declaration of Basic Principles of Justice for Victims of Crimes and Abuse of Power. The principles set out in the declarations are access to justice and fair treatment, restitution, compensation, and assistance. So, yan yung mga makukuha, okay, or ibibigay sa isang biktima. Okay, the access to justice and fair treatment, restitution, compensation, and also the assistance. Next, victimology. Victimology is simply the study of victims of crimes and their contributory role. If any in crime causation, it is also the scientific process of gaining substantial amounts of knowledge on offender characteristics by studying the nature of victims. So, ang victimology, yan yung study of victims. Okay? Kung paano sila naging biktima doon sa krimen na yon. Okay? Yan ang ibig sabihin ng victimology. Scientific study of physical, emotional, and financial harm people suffer because of illegal activities. Next, victimology versus criminology. Okay? So, first muna tayo, victimology. Victimology is best viewed as an area of specialization within criminology. While criminology embraces the scientific study of crimes, criminals, criminal laws, and the justice system, societal reactions, and crime victims. So, ang victimology lang daw is area of specialization ng criminology. While criminology naman, okay, ini-embrace niya, okay, the scientific study of crimes, criminals, lahat-lahat, including justice system and crime victims. Criminologists asked why certain individuals become involved in law breaking while others do not. While victimologists asked why some individuals, households, and entities are targeted while others are not, and why over and over again. So, magkaiba sila ng tinatanong. Okay? Ang tanong ng criminology, bakit? Okay? Ang mga individual or ang mga tao is nilalabag nila yung batas. Pero ang tanong naman ng isang victimologist, bakit ang individual, even household, or any entities is pwede siyang i-target or matarget bilang isang biktima. Okay? And paulit-ulit lang. Next, criminologists apply their findings to devise crime prevention strategies, while victimologists use patterns and trends to develop victimization, prevention strategies, and risk reduction tactics. So, magkaiba pa rin sila doon. Both criminologists and victimologists study how the criminal justice and actually works versus how it is supposed to work. So, yan ang pagkakaiba ng victimology to criminology. Next, as to boundaries. Boundaries are clear cut for criminology. Boundaries for victimology is still unclear. So, hindi pa masyadong maayos. Okay? Malabo, unclear pa, malabo pa. Overlap due to lack of boundaries. Next, the emergence of victimology. For every criminal act, there is at least one victim. Yes, totoo naman po. Okay? Every time na makakagawa ng krimen or may mangyayaring krimen, meron at merong magiging biktima. Victimology, a subfield of criminology that specializes in studying the victims of crime. Who gets victimized? Okay, sino ba yung mga nabibiktima? Victimization is not a random process. It is a process encompassing a host or systematic environmental, demographic, and personal characteristics. Victim characteristics differ according to the type of crime. Okay, next. The victim. What can be done about criminals? What can be done about victims? Victims are just to report crimes. Criminals are the superstar. Victims' role, provocation or mitigating. Code of Hammurabi required that victims make restitution or revenge. Put the law in the victim's hands. Okay, pero hindi yun pwede. Hindi naman pwede na ilagay natin yung batas sa kamay ng biktima. Okay nga? Okay? Victims have say on the punishment. Hindi po. Okay? Hindi, walang karapatan, okay, na siya ang magbigay ng punishment. Okay? Yung ginawan ng krimen. O yung tinatawag nating biktima. Next, roots, pioneers of victimology. First, we have Benjamin Mendelsohn, 1900 to 1998. Victimology should be part of criminology. Okay, part na siya because victimology is one of the specialization of criminology. Okay? Next person, Hans von Hentig, 1887 to 1974. The Criminal and His Victim. So, ayan yan. Yung mga naka-classified sa kanya or mga nakasunod-sunod. Classified victims according to personality, importance of subject-object relations, and special victimology. Okay, Hans von Hentig, a German criminologist who published an article with the title Remarks on the Interaction Between Perpetrator and Victim. He treated the victim as one of the participants in crime. Victims were classified according to the nature of involvement in the criminal act. It was thought that the study of victims' role might result in a better prevention of crime. So, si Hans von Hentig is a German criminologist. Nag-publish siya ng article titled Remarks on the Interaction between the perpetrator, kung sino yung gumawa ng krimen, and the victim itself. Okay? And ang sinasabi din niya, okay, victims' roles might result in a better prevention of crime. Okay? Baka pag nalaman natin yung role ng victim, okay, mas magiging maganda, okay, yung resulta ng prevention ng crime. Next, types of victim by Hans von Hentig. We have the depressive type, greedy type, wanton type, tormentor type. So, yan yung mga types, okay, ng victim according by Hans von Hentig. First, we have depressive type who was seen as an easy target, careless and unsuspecting. So, ang depressive type daw is easy target. Okay? Careless siya and also unsuspecting. Hindi niya parang hindi siya nagsususpect siya na pwede siyang gawing biktima. Okay? Next, we have the so-called greedy type naman. Was seen as easily duped or duped because his or her motivation for easy gain lowers his or her natural tendency to be suspicious. Yan naman yung mga greedy type. Wanton type naman is particularly vulnerable to stresses that occur at a given period of time in the life cycle, such as juvenile victims. Okay? So, ang wanton type, okay? Juvenile victims, mga dalaga, binata. Next, tormentor type, the victim of attack from the target of his abuse, such as the battered woman or the battered woman. Okay? So, tormentor type, yan naman po ang ibig sabihin ng tormentor type. Target of his abuse, such is tormentor type is yung mga ina-abuse. Like, asawang babae. Yung tinatawag nating battered woman syndrome. General classes of victims by hunting. Okay? The young, the female, the old, the mental defective, the immigrant, the minority. So, lahat pwedeng maging biktima. The young, okay, the weak by virtue of age and immaturity. Siyempre, okay, mas mabilis silang maloko, mas mabilis silang maging mabiktima. Okay? Next, female. Often less physically powerful and easily dominated by males. Yes, mas malakas pa din ang lalaki kaysa babae. Next, old. The incapable of physical defense and the common object of confidence scheme. Siyempre, kapag matanda na sila, okay, mahina na yung mga yan. Kaya isa din sila sa pwedeng maging biktima. Next, mental defective, those who are unable to think clearly. Okay? Next, emigrant, those who are unsure of the rules of conduct in the surrounding society. Okay? So, syempre, lalo yung mga turista, okay? Pwede, isa rin sila sa mga pwedeng maging biktima. Kasi hindi naman nila alam yung rules of conduct kung saan sila nakatira or saan sila nagbabakasyon. Kaya, pwede rin silang maging biktima. Next, we have the minorities. Racial prejudice may lead to victimization or unequal treatment by the agency. So, yan naman yung minorities natin. Next, we have Benjamin Mendelsohn, a criminal law scholar who presented a paper in French at a Congress in Bucharest, in which he coined the term victimology. Okay, take note, he coined the term victimology. He drew attention to the part played by victims in precipitating crimes of violence, for example, through provocation. Okay? So, siya naman po si Benjamin Mendelsohn. Types of victim by Mendelsohn. First, we have the completely innocent victim. Sino ba yung mga completely innocent victim? Person or such person is an ideal victim in popular perception. In this category, place persons victimized while they were unconscious and the child victims. Yan yung mga completely innocent victim. Isa dyan yung mga bata. Okay? Next, victims with only minor guilt and those victimized due to ignorance. Okay? Marami pong nagiging biktima dahil because of ignorance. Next, the victim who is just as guilty as the offender and the voluntary victim. Suicide cases are common to this category. Next, the victim guiltier than the offender. This category was described as containing persons who provoke the criminal or actively induce their own victimization. Ayan naman po yung mga tao, okay, na pinoprovoke, okay, yung kriminal, nagawan sila ng krimen. Next, the most guilty victim who is guilty alone. An attacker killed by a would-be victim in the act of defending themselves. Okay? So, ayan yung mga most guilty victim. Next, the imaginary victim, those suffering from mental disorders and those victims due to extreme mental abnormalities. Sila naman yung imaginary victim na tinatawag, yung may mga mental disorders and extreme mental abnormalities. Next, psychological types of victim. We have the depressed, the acquisitive or greedy, the wanton or overly sensual, the lonesome, the heartbroken, the tormentor. Okay? First, the depressed. Those submissive by virtue of emotional condition. Siyempre, kapag depressed ka, okay, mas nangingibabaw or mas mataas yung emotion mo. Okay? Nasa emotional state ka. Kaya, tinatawag kang depressed victim. Next, acquisitive or greedy. The value or act of wanting more propels such as individuals into victimization. Okay? Dahil sa pagka gusto mo pa or yung pagka selfish mo, okay? Nagiging biktima ka. Biktima. Nagiging biktima ka. Okay? So, yun naman yung greedy. Yung pagiging greedy mo, yun yung nagiging way kung bakit ka, or nagiging rason kung bakit ka nagiging biktima. Next, we have the wanton or overly sensual. Those ruled by passion and thoughtlessly seeking pleasure. Okay? Yan naman yung mga pwedeng maging biktima because of seeking pleasure. Next, we have the lonesome, similar to the acquisitive type of victim by virtue of wanting companionship or affection. Next, heartbroken, those emotionally disturbed by virtue of heartaches and pain. Siyempre, di ba, kapag ka-heartbroken ka, so, mataas yung emotion mo, okay, hindi mo alam yung ginagawa mo, or wala ka sa sarili mo. So mas madaling maging biktima ka. Next, we have the tormentor, the type of victim who asks for it, often from his own family or friends. Kagaya kanina yung battered woman. Next, we have the so-called victimization. Objectives of studying victimization. So, ito yung mga objectives. First, to count dark figure of crime, originally not concerned with victims. 2, determine inadequacy of official statistics as a crime indicator, provide estimate of hidden victimization, provide information on the aftermath of their victimization, allows researcher to assess the criminal justice system response to victim. Surveys enable researchers to gauge public attitudes towards the CGS, enables the researcher to measure levels of fear of crime, enables the researcher to tap into the number of victims and not report their victimization. Yan yung mga objectives of studying victimization. Studying of victimization scientifically. Why should victimologists not be pro-victim? Ideal victim, person who suffered harm, was weaker than the aggressor, acting virtuously or not looking for trouble or breaking any laws, and wrongdoer was a stranger acting illegally and was unprovoked. So, yan yung tinatawag nating ideal victim or yung mga ideal victim. Criminals as victims. Predatory persons prey on each other. Organized crime takes out a contact. Cycle of violence. Cycle of violence over time can transform a victims into victimizer. Group of pick on students may gang up against the bully. Battered wife may launch a vengeful attack against the husband. Convicts much more likely to have been abused physically or sexually as children. And violence begets violence. Siyempre, kapag sinasaktan mo yung asawa mo or sinasaktan ni husband yung wife niya, okay, pwedeng maging or pwedeng mag-revenge, okay, yung wife doon sa husband. Cycle of violence. Next, division within the discipline. Conservative influence focuses on basically street crimes, everyone to be held accountable for their decisions and actions, emphasis on self-reliance, not government, individual responsibility for preventing, avoiding, resisting, and recovering from criminal acts, strictly punish offenders on behalf of their victims. Yan yung mga conservative influence. Then we have also liberal influence naman, scope of field to extend beyond street crimes, endorse government intervention, extend safety net, mechanism for all kinds of misfortunes, look to wrongdoers repaying their victims to allow for reconciliation. So, yan yung mga divisions within the discipline. Okay, so, pahahapyawan lang natin yung mga yan. Next, radical critical conflict influence. Victimization is a result of oppressive social system. Scope of the field to include. So, ito yung mga field. Okay? Industrial polluters, hazardous workplaces, fraudulent advertisers, brutally violent law enforcement agencies, poverty, malnutrition, family dysfunction. So, yan yung mga pwede or kung saan magkakaroon ng biktima. Okay? Or kung saan magmumula yung tinatawag nating victim. Okay? Next, victims of crime model naman tayo. So, we have stage of impact and disorganization, stage of recall, reorganization, stage. Okay? Okay, stage of impact and disorganization during and immediately following the criminal event. Next, stage of recoil, during which the victim formulates psychological defenses and deals with conflicting emotions like guilt, anger, acceptance, and desire of revenge. Okay? Siyempre, kapag naging biktima ka, okay? So, yung psychological defenses mo, okay? Yan na yung mga emotions na meron ka, like guilt, anger, acceptance, and desire of revenge. Next, reorganization stage, during which the victim puts his or her life back to normal daily living. So, ayan na yung binabalik na niya yung normal daily living niya. Okay? Some victims, however, may not successfully adapt the victimization experience, and maladaptive organization stage may last for many years. So, yan naman yung tinatawag nating reorganization stage. Next, we have disaster victims model. So, we have pre-impact stage, okay, post-impact stage, and behavioral outcome. So, pre-impact stage, describe the state of the victim prior to being victimized. Okay? So, sabi dito, describe the state of the victim prior to being victimized. Impact or the stage at which victimization occurred. So, ayan yun. Dinidescribe nila, okay, yung impact, okay, ng victimization or nung pagkakabiktima sa kanya. Post-impact stage naman, which entails the degree and duration of personal and social disorganization following victimization. Next, we have behavioral outcome, which describes the victim's adjustment to the victimization experiences naman. Okay? Paano siya nag-a-adjust pagkatapos nung experience niya or pagkatapos nung victimization experience na nangyari sa kanya. Next, theoretical models. Okay? We have victim precipitation theory by von Hentig. Actions are the telltale stereotype and typologies. By acting in a certain provocative way, some individuals initiate a chain of events that lead to their victimization. Next, we have the so-called lifestyle model. Significance of one's lifestyle. More active and more social is equal to risk. Yes, totoo po yan. Okay? Yung mas or yung active ka masyado and yung parati kang lumalabas, nakikipag-socialize, okay? Okay, nasa nasa risk, okay, yung buhay mo. Next, so, ito yung, kung nakikita nyo, we have the illustration. Okay, 4 scenarios illustrating the degree of victim offender responsibility according to victim precipitation theory. So, degree of criminal intent of the perpetrator. So, dito, sa none, victim provocation, a woman who has suffered years of abuse, stabs and kills her husband in self-defense as he is beating her again. Dito naman sa kabila, equal responsibility, victim using the services of prostitute leaves his wallet on the bed stand and leaves. She decides to keep the money, okay, in his wallet. Then next, kung makikita nyo, so yan yung cycle or yung degree of victim, okay, according to victim precipitation. So, kung makikita nyo by arrow, so, una, none, some, more, much, pababa, none ulit. Parang umiikot lang. Kagaya nga sabi ko kanina, cycle lang siya. Okay? Next tayo, routine activities or lifestyle theory. Okay? The basic idea of lifestyle theory is that there are certain lifestyle that disproportionately expose some people to high risk for victimization. Yes, isa yan sa mga pwedeng makita sa inyo kung paano yung lifestyle mo. Okay, kaya nagiging biktima rin sila because of their lifestyle in life. Lifestyles are the routine patterned activities that people engage on a daily basis. Yan yung palagi mong ginagawa, both obligatory and optional. Most of the research in routine activities lifestyle theory has been done on rape victimization. Yes. Okay? Yan po. Next, we have victimization and the criminal justice system. Advocates for victims' rights began agitating for some of the same kinds of due process rights for victims that are enjoyed by their victimizers in the late 1960s, but it was not until 1982 that a federal task force was set up to examine the treatment of victims by the criminal justice system. The fair and decent treatment of victims by the system, okay, to some extent to get over their victimization. So, yan yung victimization and the criminal justice system. Next, the consequences of victimization. Overall, financial losses per crime do not appear overly large. The worst consequences are psychological. Okay? Lalo na kapag rape yung nangyari sa'yo. Psychological. Okay? Ang pinaka-worst na consequence. Rape trauma syndrome, kagaya ng sabi ko, re-experiencing the event via flashback. Siyempre, hindi yun maiiwasan na mag-flashback sa'yo. Yung mga masasayang memories mo nga nagpa-flashback. Paano pa kayong mga worst memories mo, di ba? Avoiding anything at all associated with the event and general numbness or affect. Violent victimization helps to shape the life course, okay, trajectories of victims. So, yan yung mga consequence kapag ka naging biktima ka. Next, victim assistance programs. So, first we have victim compensation, court services, victim services programs, and public education. Yan yung mga assistance program na pwedeng ibigay sa kanila. And also, we have crisis intervention, victim offender reconciliation programs, or yung tinatawag nating VORP, and evaluation of victim assistance programs. Okay? So, yan po yung mga yan. Next, we have the so-called victim's role in the criminal justice system. Ano nga ba yung role ng victim in criminal justice system natin? Participation at all stages during the criminal justice process. We have reporting stage, investigation stage, pre-trial stage, trial stage, sentencing stage, stage at which the offender is released. Victim-sensitive measures, interviewing techniques, modified courtrooms, video evidence, victims' advocates, special provisions for vulnerable groups such as children or victims of HGBV crimes, victims' impact statements, and party, civil or civil party. Okay, yan yung mga victim-sensitive measures. Okay? Next, labeling academic victimology and victim advocacy. Completing criminal justice models are variously pitched against each other in an effort to assert the dominance of so-called victim-centered or offender-centered justice. Academic victimology and victim advocacy are often reduced to categorize that reflect the competing interests of those promoting different models, frequently with political goals in mind. In developing the theory of a critical victimology, Moby and Bokleit on 1994 identified three broad categories in academic victimology. So, ipapakita ko sa inyo yung three broad categories. The positive, the radical, and the critical. Positive defines victimization according to the criminal law, wedded to ideas of victim, precipitation, blaming, proposes victimology as a science. Okay, yan yung positive. Sa radical naman, it includes victimization beyond the confines of the criminal law, encompasses human rights, examines the role of the capitalist state in victimization. And critical naman, combines aspect of positivism and radicalism to reconceptualize the victim, looks at experiences of individual victims and the influence of social political powers on them, critiques the victim's constructions as a consumer of victim services. So, yan yung mga three broad categories ng academic victimization natin. We have the positive, radical, and the critical. In turn, along with Carmen, 1990, Movey and Woklet, okay, identify three socio-political victim trends that variously cross-cut and reflect academic victimology. We have the conservative, liberal, and radical critical. Conservative focuses on victims of street crimes, renders people accountable for their actions, focuses on retributive justice. Liberal naman extends the conservative focus to include fraud, white-collar crimes, encourage restitution and rehabilitation for victim and offender. In radical critical naman, all forms of human suffering are considered as politically valid. The criminal justice system is critical, okay, as the cause of much secondary victimization. Focuses on institutional wrongdoing and violation of human rights. So, yan yung three socio-political victim ng academic victimology, the conservative, liberal, and radical critical. Next, Okay? Van Ditch, outlining the history of victimology and victim advocacy, simplifies these divergent strands by distinguishing between two that can variously include conservative, liberal, and radical responses to research and victim assistance. So this one, guys, okay, we have the penal victimology and general victimology. Ano yung tinatawag nating penal victimology? Confined to the criminal law and the dynamic relationship between victim and offender encompasses positivism. Okay? So, relationship between victim and offender po ang penal victimology. Next, we have the general victimology, includes victimization outside the criminal law. Kasi kapag penal law, okay, confined. Confined, ibig sabihin nasa loob. Ito naman sa general victimology outside criminal law, employs research method, other positivism, incorporates victim assistance and medical psychiatric intervention with victims. Ayan yung pagkakaiba nila. Yung isa naka-confined to the criminal law, yung isa naman outside criminal law. Victim support. Over the years, okay, acted as a source of support to millions of crime victims. Victims can directly approach the organization for support. The police refer a large proportion of victims to the organization, who are then first approached by means of a letter and subsequently, in certain cases, by directly contact. In effect, victim support provides the sticking plaster for many victims in the aftermath of the crime. In comparison, Britain's rape crisis, with its overtly feminist agenda, asked the establishment uncomfortable questions about the causes of women's victimization at the hands of men, and frames arguments in the context of patriarchal social structure, where rape crisis marches to protest its agenda. Victim support regularly sit with government representatives to work, okay, for change for victims from within the society. As a reflection of these two different approaches, victim support have enjoyed extensive government funding over the years, while rape crisis has struggled financial to survive. So, ito yung tinatawag nating victim support. Okay, yan yung mga nagiging support nila. Like in government, ayan yung binibigay nila. Okay? Binibigyan sila ng pera or meron silang fund for victim support. Next, criminal neglect suggested that victim-centered criminal justice system develops do very little to support the majority of victims. These provisions, okay, do nothing to help 96% of victims. These are the people whose offenders are not detected and whose cases are not processed through the criminal justice system. Single-issue groups. Single-issue victim groups exist to support and promote the cause of certain victims. In UK, these groups tends to be formed and run by volunteers who have either directly experienced victimization, such as rape or domestic violence, or whose loved ones have been the victims of crime, such as murder. These self-help organizations usually operate the budgets to assist the victims and supervisors of particular crimes, and often lobby government and criminal justice agencies in an effort to improve services for victims. Single-issue groups epitomize the realization of the slogan, "The personal is political." Next, building good practice in victimology. What is good practice? Good practice needs definition with respect to project goals. success stories, and responsibilities for replication in other settings. Who defines and interprets practices as good is an important consideration, and where possible, victims' voices should be heard alongside practitioners, policymakers, and academics. Comparative and cross-national. Comparative and cross-national examples of victim-centered good practice need to be sensitive to the different social, cultural practices that are particularly to each institution, community, and country. Questions need to be considered alone the different ascription of victim and the limitations imposed on the transfer of some good practices, ideas between different legal cultures. The place of the victim. So, yan yung ibig sabihin ng ating good practices and comparative and cross-national. Next, bearing in mind the above 3-point criteria for undertaking good practice. Research the following represents a useful extended checklist adapted from the author's work on victim of sex trafficking of what needs to be considered when working with and for crime victims in light of empirical evidence. Positive result, identify projects through result with a positive tangible impact of victim. Sustainable naman, look for projects which a long-term and durable shelf life that can, where appropriate, offer assistance to victims over a prolonged period. In innovative naman, identify projects that employ new and or innovative responses to victims that have been deemed successful. Identify and reject established practices that cannot prove, okay, they have interest of the victim. So, ito yung mga tatlo, okay, na need to be considered when working with and for crime victims in light of empirical evidences. The positive result, syempre, sustainable, okay, yung pag-sustain mo, and then the innovative, yung innovation, okay. So, we have also replicability, transferability, cooperation, and ethical. First, replicability and transferability. Seek practical solution that can be transferred in other setting. Be this locally national or international. Pwede siyang maging local, pwede siyang maging national, and also pwede siyang maging international. Encourage information exchange between projects about success stories and failures in an effort to replicate success. Cooperation naman needs to be encouraged between different agencies working with victim. This avoids completion for resources between agencies and unnecessary replication of project ideas. Next, ethical. Projects should employ ethical values towards victims. To this end, due consideration should be given to the experiences and opinions of victims. Okay, so yan naman yung mga ibig sabihin ng replicability o cooperation and ethical. So, this is the end of my discussion. Thank you for watching and listening, and also please like and subscribe.